The key was still warm when they found it in her coat pocket, and that detail would haunt Detective Marcus Webb for the rest of his life, not because it was impossible, though it was, but because it seemed to suggest intention, purpose, as though Eleanor Ashford, in her final moments, had deliberately held that key close to her body, warming it with the last of her life's heat, a final act of care for something made of brass and old metal. He rolled it between his palms in the study of the Ashford house on that gray October morning, feeling the fading warmth, and he knew with the kind of certainty that detectives develop over decades that this case would not be what it appeared to be. The house itself was exactly what you'd expect from a woman of Eleanor Ashford's age and station. 92 years old, widow of 15 years, a career spent in museum curation, a life lived with deliberate precision. The study where they found her was a room that seemed to exist outside of normal time books, lining every wall from floor to ceiling of leather. Wing-back chair positioned near a window that looked out onto a garden that had gone slightly wild in autumn. Eleanor was sitting in that chair, her reading glasses resting on the open page of a biography of Margaret Thatcher, her hands folded in her lap, her head tilted slightly to one side, as though she simply decided to stop living, and had done so with the same careful consideration she brought to everything else in her life. The initial assessment from the first responders was straightforward: natural causes. Death from old age, the heart simply stopping after 92 years of beating. The medical examiner, a woman named Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, who had seen enough deaths to recognize the difference between what looked peaceful and what was actually peaceful, scheduled Eleanor for autopsy more as a formality than anything else. Nothing about the scene suggested foul play. The house was secure. Eleanor had lived alone for 15 years, since her husband Douglas had died of a heart attack at 75. She had a grandson who visited weekly, 2 daughters who called regularly, and a circle of friends from the museum who had coffee with her every Thursday. By all measures, Eleanor Ashford had lived a life of reasonable contentment, surrounded by books and memories, and the accumulated objects of a long existence. But Eleanor had left a note. It was there on the blotter of her desk, written on the back of an old envelope in Eleanor's precise, careful handwriting, the handwriting of someone who had spent decades labeling museum artifacts and cataloging collections. The note was short, just one line. Asterisk, the keys are not where they should be. Asterisk, nothing else. No explanation, no context, no indication of what Eleanor meant or why she thought this information was important enough to write down, apparently in the hours before she died. Marcus first learned about the note when Sarah Chun, his partner of 14 years, called him at home on that October morning. Sarah had a voice that carried information efficiently, without flourish, which was one of the reasons they worked well together despite their temperamental differences. "There's a note," she said. "That's why they're calling us in. Natural death, but a note. The daughter thinks we should take a look." Marcus had driven to the house with his coffee growing cold in the cup holder of his sedan, thinking about notes and what they meant. In his experience, notes left by people near the end of their lives fell into predictable categories. Suicide notes, which were usually anguished and detailed. Notes of instruction, which were practical and specific. And notes of accusation, which were angry or desperate. What he didn't often encounter were notes that raised more questions than they answered. Sarah was already in the study when he arrived, standing with her hands on her hips, studying the note with a skeptical expression she usually reserved for witness testimonies that didn't quite add up. She was tall and lean with dark hair, streaked with gray that she wore in a neat braid, and she had the kind of face that didn't reveal much, which was either a gift or a curse, depending on the situation. "The family's insisting it's not suicide," she said without preamble. "The grandson says his grandmother wasn't depressed. The daughters say she was in good health. The doctor confirms no obvious signs of illness." So we have a healthy woman who dies peacefully in her chair and leaves a cryptic note about keys. Keys, Marcus repeated, and Sarah gave him the look she always gave him when he started to fixate on details that did and immediately seem relevant. She had a lot of them, Sarah said, gesturing around the study. Look, and that was when Marcus began to understand that this case would be different from the beginning. The keys were everywhere, hanging from hooks on the wall beside Eleanor's desk, sitting in a pottery dish on the windowsill, arranged in a leather organizer on the desk itself, each one carefully labeled in Eleanor's handwriting. Marcus walked slowly through the study, then through the rest of the house, counting as he went. The kitchen had 17 keys hanging from a rack. The mudroom had a bowl containing at least a dozen more. The bedroom held a small wooden box filled with keys. By the time he finished his first complete walkthrough, Marcus had counted 97 keys in total, not including the one they'd found in Eleanor's coat pocket, which made 98. She was a curator, Sarah said, reading from the file. Worked at the Ashford Museum for 40 years. Retired 20 years ago. Husband was Douglas Ashford, also a curator, died in 1990. 2 daughters, Caroline and Margaret. 1 grandson, James. No other significant relationships or dependents listed. Marcus was examining the leather key organizer on Eleanor's desk. It was the kind of thing you might find in a stationery store or order from a catalog, designed to hold perhaps 20 keys in neat rows. Eleanor had keys arranged by what appeared to be a personal filing system. They were organized not alphabetically, but by some other logic that made sense to her. Each key had a tiny typed label. Asterisk kitchen cabinet circa 1987. Asterisk asterisk Douglas's office, removed 1993. Asterisk asterisk music box, grandmother's. Asterisk asterisk guest house, sold 1995. Asterisk the key from Eleanor's pocket didn't have a label. Run this through the database, Marcus said to Sarah, holding up the key. See if we can match it to any locks in the city. And get a warrant for her financial records. I want to know about any properties, any accounts, anything that might help us figure out what this key opens. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You think this is something? The note? I think Eleanor Ashford was careful and organized and didn't write notes at random. I think if she wrote something, it meant something. And I think that key means something too. The medical examiner's preliminary report came back the next day. Eleanor Ashford had died of natural causes heart failure, pure and simple. No toxins, no injuries, no signs of foul play or struggle. Her organs were remarkable for a woman of her age. Her doctor's notes indicated that Eleanor had been in better health than many people half her age. Her blood pressure controlled, her cholesterol manageable, her mental acuity sharp as a knife. By all medical measures, Eleanor should have lived another 5 or 10 years. And yet her heart had simply stopped. Arrhythmia, Dr. Okonkwo told them in her office, showing them the preliminary results. An irregular heartbeat. Sometimes they're manageable, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're brought on by stress, and sometimes they just happen. Eleanor's heart showed evidence of old scarring. She may have had a previous incident she never reported. In any case, her heart stopped, and her brain couldn't sustain consciousness without it. That's the end of the story from a medical perspective. Unless she scared herself to death, Marcus said quietly. That's not medicine, Dr. Okonkwo replied. That's philosophy. The key in Eleanor's coat pocket turned out to be a model that the First National Bank had, used from the late 1980s until the early 2000s. A bank representative, a nervous man named Garrett, who seemed to find something transgressive about discussing the deceased's financial privacy, confirmed that Eleanor had maintained a safety deposit box under her name since 1994, 30 years. The contents of the box were unknown, as Eleanor had been the sole signatory, and upon her death, her family would have rights of access, but they would need a key to open it. This key? Marcus held up the brass key in its small evidence bag. Garrett examined it without touching it, his hands trembling slightly. That's consistent with our model from that era, yes. We've phased them out. Modern security systems are far more sophisticated, but it could certainly be one of ours. They obtained a warrant. The bank provided access to Eleanor's deposit box, though they used an emergency master key rather than Eleanor's brass key. Inside, they found something that should have remained hidden, something that Eleanor had apparently decided, in her final moments or perhaps over many years, should eventually be found. There were letters, tied with a faded red ribbon. There were photographs, black and white, dated across 5 decades, showing houses, dozens of them, from different angles and in different seasons. There was a ledger, leather-bound, and filled with Eleanor's precise handwriting, dated from 1954 to 1985. And there was a note, written in Eleanor's hand, addressed to whom it may concern. Asterisk, if you are reading this, I am dead. If I am dead, then the secret is yours. I have carried it for 30 years, and it has been the weight that defined my life. I do not know if telling it will redeem me or condemn me further. I only know that it can no longer remain in darkness. Asterisk. Marcus read the ledger standing in the bank's office, and as he read, he began to understand why Eleanor's heart had stopped, why she had carried that key in her pocket, keeping it warm against her body, why a woman who had organized every detail of her life had also written a note that would lead directly to the unraveling of everything. The first entry in the ledger was dated January 1954. Asterisk, I married Douglas today. He is beautiful and kind, and he knows things about the world that I do not. He promised to teach me. He promised to show me how to be the kind of wife that a man like him deserves. I am happy. I think I will always be happy. I think that life with Douglas will be an endless series of small discoveries and quiet moments and the satisfaction of being known by another person completely. The entry was written in a younger hand, less certain, more open. Eleanor's handwriting then showed evidence of genuine joy, of the kind of optimism that only comes from the beginning of things. By 1956, the handwriting had changed. Asterisk D, found something. Won't say what. Says it's safer that I don't know. But I know. I know the way his hands shake when he doesn't think I'm watching. I know the way he doesn't eat anymore, or he eats and then excuses himself from the table. I know the way he comes home smelling like places I don't recognize. I know something is wrong, and it's not the kind of wrong that fixes itself with time, or prayer, or the attention of a good wife. It's the kind of wrong that deepens. It's the kind of wrong that becomes a hole that swallows everything around it. Asterisk, asterisk, I asked him where he goes on Thursday nights. He told me it was museum business, but the museum is closed on Thursdays. He knows I know this. I think he wanted me to know that he's lying. I think he wanted me to ask questions, so he would have an excuse to tell me the truth. Or perhaps I'm simply inventing intentions that don't exist, the way people do when they're afraid. Asterisk, the entries throughout 1957 described Eleanor's growing horror, her dawning realization that her husband was not the man she'd believed him to be. But what was remarkable was the careful way she documented it. Eleanor was a curator, trained to observe and record and preserve evidence. Even in her fear, even in her growing despair, she maintained that training. She noted dates. She noted observations. She recorded conversations almost word for word, trying to capture the exact meaning of what Douglas was telling her, as though precision of language might somehow make sense of the senseless. Asterisk, he showed me today. I wish he hadn't. I wish I could return to the time before I knew. But he said I had to know, in case something happened to him, in case he wasn't here anymore. Someone had to know, and it had to be someone he could trust. Asterisk, asterisk, he took me to a house outside the city. A small house, white with green shutters, the kind of house where a family might live. He had a key. He used it to open the front door. Inside, it was dark. He turned on the lights, and I saw ... asterisk. The entry stopped. Eleanor had written the first sentence of the next paragraph, and then crossed it out so vigorously that she torn the paper slightly. She tried again. Asterisk, I cannot describe what I saw. There are no words for it. Asterisk, she tried once more. Asterisk, there are people in the house. They are alive. They are being kept there deliberately. They are fed and given water, and otherwise left alone. Douglas says they are safe. He says they are being protected. He says the world is too much for some people, and he is providing them sanctuary from it. Asterisk, asterisk, I asked him how many. He said not to ask. He said the answer would make it too real. Asterisk, asterisk, I asked him who they are. He said they are people who have nowhere else to go. People who have tried to escape the world before and failed. People who are better off in the quiet and the dark and the certainty of routine. Asterisk, asterisk, I asked him if they're prisoners. He said that's a matter of perspective. Asterisk, the photographs provided context that Eleanor's words couldn't quite articulate. They showed houses, dozens of them, hundreds by the end of the ledger's timeline photographed from different angles. Some were grand and Victorian, sitting back from the street on sprawling properties. Others were modest cottages, the kind that might sit on the edge of a small town without anyone paying particular attention to them. A few were apartment buildings in the city, their fronts indistinguishable from hundreds of other apartment buildings. Each photograph was labeled on the back with an address, a date, and a single notation. Asterisk occupied asterisk or asterisk empty asterisk. By 1959, the ledger showed 42 addresses. By 1965, the number had grown to 58. By 1975, Eleanor had documented what appeared to be nearly 100 different properties, though she noted that she wasn't certain of the exact number because Douglas wouldn't tell her. Asterisk, he says the number isn't important. Asterisk, Eleanor wrote in 1970. Asterisk, he says what matters is the work. The work is to find people who are broken and to provide them shelter from the world that broke them. The work is sacred, he says. The work is all that matters. Asterisk, asterisk, I have become a monster's wife. And worse, I have become an accomplice to his monstrosity. Asterisk, the entries throughout the 1970s showed Eleanor in various stages of despair. She documented the routine they developed, the Thursday visits where she would drive to assigned houses and drop off supplies. Food, water, blankets, sometimes medications that Douglas's accomplice, a nurse at the city hospital, would provide. The Sunday visits where Douglas would take her to check on properties, though he rarely let her see inside anymore. The terrible knowledge that she carried alone, unable to tell anyone, unable to leave, unable to do anything but maintain the system that her husband had constructed. Asterisk, I spoke to a woman at the grocery store today who was looking for her sister. She had an old address from years ago. She thought her sister might have rented an apartment in the building that Douglas owns on Ashford Street. I told her I'd never heard of anyone by that name, but I had. Douglas had shown me the photograph. The woman's sister had been in house number 7 until Douglas deactivated it in 1974. I don't know where she is now. Douglas says she's at peace. Asterisk, asterisk. What does peace mean when you're locked in a basement? By 1980, Eleanor's entries had become sparse and almost clinical. She'd stopped asking questions. She'd stopped trying to understand Douglas's justifications or rationalize what was happening. She simply recorded the facts, the way a person might record information about an experiment they were conducting, though the experiment was composed of human suffering, and the experimenter was the man she'd married. Asterisk 49 houses listed as active, 23 deactivated, 216 visits recorded. I have stopped counting the number of people. Douglas says I'm stronger if I don't know the number. I believe he's right. The number would be too much. The number would break something in me that I still need in order to continue. Asterisk. In 1985, 2 years after Douglas's death from a heart attack at 75, Eleanor wrote what appeared to be her final entry. Asterisk, he's gone now. I watched him die. I sat beside him in the hospital, and I watched his heart stop, and I felt something strange. Relief, perhaps. Or the final breaking of something that had already been broken for 3 decades. He didn't ask me to continue the work. He didn't need to. The work continues because it's been set in motion, and stopping it now would be admitting that it was wrong from the beginning. It was wrong. I know this. But to admit it would require me to accept responsibility for 30 years of complicity. It would require me to go to the police and destroy my own life, and my daughter's lives, and my grandchild's life. It would require me to sacrifice everything to atone for something I didn't create, but was unable to stop. Asterisk, asterisk, so I continue. I visit the houses. I maintain them. I keep the keys organized. And I wait for something punishment, perhaps, or redemption, or simply death to release me from this existence. Asterisk, asterisk, I think soon. I think I'm close to the end of bearing this. The weight of it is becoming too much. I can feel it in my chest, a tightness, a pressure. I think my heart will do what Douglas's heart did. I think soon I will be free. Asterisk, asterisk, if someone is reading this, know that I was a coward. I was capable of confronting the horror, and I chose not to. I chose comfort and security, and the preservation of my family's reputation over the lives of the people my husband imprisoned. That is a sin that I will carry into death. Can I accept that judgment? Asterisk, asterisk, the keys are in the safety deposit box. The addresses are here. The ledger is here. Let whoever reads it decide what should be done with this knowledge. I can no longer carry it alone. Asterisk. After reading Eleanor's ledger, Marcus and Sarah sat in silence in the bank's private office for what felt like a long time. Outside the windows, Garrett, the bank manager, was pretending not to watch them, while actually watching them very carefully, waiting to see if the 2 detectives would stand up and run screaming, or simply sit quietly with the weight of what they'd learned. How many addresses? Sarah finally asked. Marcus counted again, checking his numbers against what Eleanor had written. 94 properties documented as active at various points. 32 listed as still active in 1985, her final entry. Of those 32, we'd need to cross-reference with current property records to see which ones still exist. We're going to need a warrant, Sarah said. More than one. We're going to need to get the FBI involved. We're going to need to declare this the largest criminal investigation in the state's history. But what they found, over the next 6 months of intensive searching and forensic investigation, turned out to be even worse than Eleanor's ledger suggested. The first house they accessed was a property 15 miles outside the city, a white house with green shutters, the one Eleanor had described in her 1957 entry, the first place Douglas had taken her. The house had been unoccupied for months, the utilities disconnected, the front door marked with an eviction notice from a property management company. But when they broke in, when they searched the basement, when they found the locked room that could only be opened with a key that Eleanor had kept in her organized collection, they found human remains. Not fresh remains. Remains that had been there for many years, perhaps 8 or 9 years, the skeletal structure preserved by the cool darkness and the sealed room. The medical examiner identified the remains as female, age approximately 53. Dental records eventually confirmed the identity. Margaret Hollister, reported missing in 1974, initially classified as a voluntary departure, because Margaret had attempted suicide twice in the preceding months and had told friends she was thinking about going away. The second house, a small cottage in a rural area, contained the remains of a man, estimated to have been deceased for 14 years. The third house, a townhouse in the city, held the skeletal remains of 2 bodies, a young man and a young woman. apparently roughly contemporary, dated to approximately the mid-1980s. By the end of the investigation, they'd found the remains of 46 people. 46 individuals, each one a person with a name and a family and a history, locked in the dark rooms of Douglas Ashford's carefully maintained network of houses. Some had been starved. Some had died of untreated infections. Some bore signs of violence, though the majority appeared to have simply ceased living, their bodies preserved by time and isolation. I have carried this key for 15 years. I don't know what it opens. I've tried it in every lock I could find, but it belongs to nothing and nowhere. I think Eleanor left it there deliberately. I think she left it as a kind of memorial, a way of saying that Margaret was real, that she mattered, that even though she was lost in the dark, someone had acknowledged her existence. I'm an old woman now, older than my sister ever got to be. I've had a life that Margaret didn't have the chance to have. I've had 60 more years than she did, and I'm tired of carrying the weight of knowing what happened to her. I've decided to let it go. I'm leaving this key to you, Detective. Not because I think you'll be able to use it for anything, but because I think you understand what it means. I think you understand that sometimes objects carry meaning beyond their function. Sometimes they're just reminders. Reminders that people disappeared. Reminders that someone noticed. Reminders that even when the world moves on, even when the case closes and the perpetrators die and the victims are buried, there's someone who still remembers. Keep the key if you want to. Destroy it if you prefer. Or pass it along to someone else who might understand. All I ask is that you remember that my sister was real, that she existed, that she mattered. James Hollister Marcus kept the key. He never tried it in any lock, never investigated which key it might be or where it might have come from. He simply placed it in a small box on his desk, and every time he looked at it, he thought about Eleanor in her study, carrying warmth in her pocket, preparing to relinquish the burden she'd carried for 40 years. He thought about the nature of complicity, how it wasn't always a choice made consciously, deliberately, with full knowledge. How sometimes it was the result of loving someone, of being bound to them by marriage and history, and the thousand small compromises that people make to preserve the lives they've built. How Eleanor had faced an impossible choice between her own moral clarity and the preservation of the life she'd constructed, and she'd chosen the latter and then carried the weight of that choice until her heart simply couldn't bear it anymore. He thought about the 46 people whose names had been forgotten, whose disappearances had been classified and filed away. He thought about the families who'd spent decades not knowing what had happened to the people they loved. He thought about Margaret Hollister's sister, James, who had spent 60 years knowing the truth and carrying it alone. And he thought about doors, about the locked rooms that Douglas had created and Eleanor had maintained, about the doors that could only be opened with specific keys, that could only be understood by people who possessed the knowledge to unlock them. He thought about how the world contained locked doors everywhere, and how some of those doors protected things that deserved to be protected, while others protected only horror and cruelty and the terrible secrets that people kept to preserve their own lives. Years passed. Marcus eventually retired. The young detective who took over his cases received the key during the handoff of active files, and Marcus told her the entire story, all of it, the case from beginning to end, the names and the photographs and the ledger that now sat in police archives, preserved as evidence of what one man had done and what one woman had allowed. What should I do with it? The young detective asked, holding the warm brass key. Marcus smiled, though the smile was sad. That, he said, is up to you. But I'll tell you what Eleanor taught me, even though she taught it too late. The most important thing we can do is ensure that someone remembers. Not to forget it, we should never forget, but to ensure that the story doesn't disappear. To ensure that the people who are lost are acknowledged. to ensure that the next person who faces the choice Eleanor faced understands what the cost of choosing silence might be. The young detective took the key. Marcus never learned what she did with it, whether she kept it or passed it along, or eventually destroyed it. But sometimes, in his final years, he wondered if every key carried a story. If every lock in every house on every street protected something that somebody had decided the world shouldn't see. If every sealed room contained a truth that would fracture the surface of normal life, if only someone had the courage to open it. He never found a definitive answer. But he learned to live with the question. He learned to sit with the discomfort of knowing that evil could hide in plain sight in a house on a hog. Normal Street maintained by a woman who made tea and read biographies and kept her keys organized in a leather case. He learned that evil didn't require masks or darkness. It required only the quiet complicity of someone who had decided that some doors were better left closed. The case files sat in the police department's archives, gathering dust, occasionally accessed by criminology students or true crime enthusiasts or historians researching the nature of American violence. Eleanor's ledger was cited in academic papers and referenced in true crime podcasts. The addresses of the houses, the ones that had been demolished, became a kind of macabre pilgrimage site for people who found fascination in other people suffering. But Eleanor herself was largely forgotten. The newspapers and the books and the television specials focused on Douglas Ashford, who at least had the distinction of being the architect of the horror. Eleanor was relegated to a secondary role, the complicit wife, the woman who'd enabled the crimes, the moral coward who'd chosen silence over righteousness. Nobody seemed to understand that her complicity was itself a tragedy, that Eleanor was, in many ways, as much a victim as the people she'd helped imprison, albeit a victim of her own choices. Marcus understood this, though. In his long retirement, living in a small apartment overlooking a river, Marcus spent many hours thinking about Eleanor. He thought about the moment when she'd made the choice, or rather the series of moments, because it wasn't one choice, but 1,000 small choices made over 30 years. Each choice to remain silent. Each choice to visit the houses and deliver supplies. Each choice to maintain the keys and keep the ledger and carry the weight of knowing. He imagined the moment when Eleanor had decided to write that note. Asterisk, the keys are not where they should be. Asterisk, she'd written it knowing that it would be found, knowing that it would lead investigators to the safety deposit box, to the ledger, to the addresses, to the truth. It was an act of confession, disguised as a riddle. It was Eleanor's way of finally, after 40 years, choosing honesty over silence. And it had cost her everything, her life, her reputation, her legacy. She would be remembered as a woman who had allowed monsters to flourish, not as a woman who had finally, at the moment of her death, chosen to stop protecting them. In Marcus's retirement, he often sat by the window of his apartment and thought about this progression, the slow accumulation of secrets, the way complicity grew like a fungus in the dark, the manner in which one choice to remain silent led inevitably to the next choice, and the next, until the silence became so vast that it was impossible to break through it without destroying everything. He thought about what Eleanor must have felt in those last years, after Douglas's death, when she continued to maintain the houses out of a kind of inertia, out of habit, out of the sense that stopping would somehow be an admission that all those years had meant nothing. And he thought about the moment she decided to let the secret out, the moment she placed the key in her pocket and written the note, and then simply sat down in her chair and allowed her heart to stop. There was a kind of grace in that decision, Marcus felt. Not redemption, Eleanor couldn't be redeemed by it, but perhaps a kind of final acknowledgement, perhaps a way of saying, I choose truth now, even though the truth will destroy me. One choose honesty now, even though it comes too late. The brass key on Marcus's desk eventually became a kind of talisman for him, a reminder of the case that had defined his career. a symbol of everything he'd learned about the nature of human darkness and the ways that ordinary people could become complicit in extraordinary evil. He would pick it up sometimes and hold it the way Eleanor must have held it in her pocket, and he would think about what it represented, not just access to some unknown lock, but the weight of knowledge, the burden of secrets, the terrible responsibility that came with knowing things that couldn't be unknown. One afternoon, when Marcus was in his mid-70s, a woman came to his apartment. She was younger than him, perhaps in her 60s, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had spent a long time carrying a burden. She introduced herself as Catherine Ashford, the granddaughter of Eleanor and Douglas, the daughter of Eleanor's eldest daughter, Carolyn. "My mother passed away," Catherine said, sitting in the chair across from Marcus. "She left me some things, documents, and a letter addressed to Detective Marcus Webb, care of the police department. They told me you were retired, but gave me your address." The letter was written in Caroline's careful script. Marcus remembered Carolyn from the investigation, a woman in her 50s then, now presumably deceased, which Catherine confirmed. Caroline had lived to be 84, had spent decades in Portland working as a therapist, had never publicly discussed her family's history. The letter explained this absence. Asterisk Detective Webb, asterisk asterisk, I have spent my entire life running from the truth about my family, my mother and my father, and the terrible things that happened in their marriage and their home. When I was a child, I sensed that something was wrong, though I didn't understand what. I noticed my mother's silences, the way she would disappear for hours, the way certain phone calls seemed to frighten her. When I was a teenager, I overheard a conversation that suggested something darker, a reference to the houses and the keys, and a desperate tone in my mother's voice that frightened me. Asterisk asterisk, I chose not to investigate. I chose not to ask questions. I chose, instead, to leave, to move across the country, to build a life as far away from my family as possible. This was cowardice, much like my mother's own cowardice. But it was also, I think, the only way I could survive. The only way I could build a self that wasn't defined by the horror that had defined my family. Asterisk asterisk. When the case came to light, when the truth was revealed publicly, I felt a strange combination of emotions. Relief that the secret was finally out. Guilt that I hadn't uncovered it sooner. Shame that my father had done these things. Anger that my mother had allowed them. And ultimately, forgiveness. I forgave my mother because I came to understand, through my work as a therapist, that complicity isn't always a conscious choice. Sometimes it's the result of fear and love, and the desperate desire to preserve something that seems worth preserving. Asterisk asterisk. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that the case didn't end with my parents' deaths or even with the investigation's conclusion. It continues through generations. It continues in the way that my sister and I have spent our entire lives trying not to be the children of a serial murderer and his accomplice. It continues in the way that my children have had to decide whether to claim their family history or deny it. It continues in the trauma that trauma creates, the way that knowing what happened in those houses has shaped every aspect of our lives. Asterisk asterisk. But I also want you to know that there was goodness in my mother, alongside the complicity. There was a woman who loved her daughters and who tried, in her limited way, to protect us from the knowledge she carried. There was a woman who eventually chose honesty over silence, who wrote the note that led to the truth, who decided that the weight of keeping the secret was greater than the weight of letting it out. Asterisk asterisk. I don't expect forgiveness from you or from anyone. But I ask that when you think about my mother, you think about her complexity. Think about the terrible position she was in. Think about the choices she faced and the way that all of her choices seemed impossible. Think about what it means to love someone who is evil. Think about what it means to be complicit in evil, not through active choice, but through the passive choice to remain silent. Asterisk. If you still have my mother's key, the one that was warm in her pocket on the day she died, would like to ask you something. I would like to ask you to keep it. Not because it opens anything, not because it means anything in a practical sense, but because it represents something important. It represents the moment when my mother finally decided that the truth mattered more than her own life. It represents the instant when she chose honesty over silence, even though that choice cost her everything. Asterisk, asterisk, keep the key, detective. Keep it as a reminder. Keep it as a memorial to my mother's complicity and my mother's final act of courage. Keep it as a monument to the terrible complexity of human nature and the ways that ordinary people can become entangled in extraordinary evil. Asterisk, asterisk, Carl Ashford, asterisk, Marcus wept when he finished reading the letter. Catherine, watching him, said nothing, allowing him his grief. When he could speak again, he told Catherine the story of the case, all of it from beginning to end. He told her about Eleanor's ledger, and the 46 people, and the houses and the keys. He told her about the investigation and the prosecution, and Eleanor's quiet testimony. And he told her about his own journey with the case, the way it had haunted him for decades, the way he'd come to understand complicity, not as a simple moral failing, but as a human tragedy. "I have something for you," Marcus said when he'd finished. He went to his desk and retrieved the small box containing the brass key, Eleanor's key, the one she'd carried in her pocket on the day she died. "This was your grandmother's. She carried it with her at the end. I don't know what it opens, and I don't think it opens anything, but it represents something. It represents the moment when your grandmother decided to finally speak the truth." Catherine took the key. She held it in her palm, the same way Eleanor must have held it, the way Marcus had held it so many times. "Do you think she found peace?" Catherine asked. "When she died?" Marcus considered the question. "I think she found something," he said finally. Whether it was peace or simply the absence of the weight she'd been carrying, I don't know. But I think she found something like relief. I think she decided that telling the truth was worth dying for. Catherine came to visit Marcus several times before he died. They would sit in his apartment and talk about Eleanor, about the nature of complicity and forgiveness, about the way that families carry trauma through generations. Catherine told him that she'd decided to become a historian, that she was researching the case for a book that she wanted to tell Eleanor's story in a way that acknowledged both her complicity and her final act of courage. "My mother spent her whole life trying to escape the family history," Catherine said. "But I think it's important to face it, not to be defined by it, but to acknowledge it, to understand that my family did terrible things, but also to understand that my grandmother, in the end, chose honesty." Marcus encouraged her in this work. He gave her copies of the case files, introduced her to Sarah Chun, who was still alive, retired and living not far away, and helped her understand the investigation from the perspective of someone who'd lived through it. He also gave her something else, a list of the 46 names, the people whose remains had been identified. He'd compiled this list years earlier, had kept it in a drawer in his desk, had updated it as new identifications were made. "They should be remembered," he told Catherine, "not just as victims of a crime, but as people, as individuals with names and histories and lives that mattered." Catherine used that list in her book. The book, which was published 5 years after Marcus's death, became a kind of memorial to Eleanor and to all the people whose lives had been stolen. It told the story of the case, but it also told the story of Eleanor's life, her marriage to Douglas, her slow descent into complicity, her final act of confession. The book was called Asterisk, The Weight of Keys Asterisk, and it became required reading in criminology programs across the country. In the book, Catherine wrote about her grandmother with a kind of compassionate understanding. Asterisk Eleanor Ashford was not a hero. She did not save anyone. She did not prevent her husband's crimes or report him to authorities. She was, by any reasonable standard, complicit in the murder and imprisonment of 46 people. But Eleanor was also a woman trapped in an impossible situation, a woman who loved someone who was evil, a woman who was forced to choose between her own moral clarity and the preservation of the life she built. She chose the life. And then, 40 years later, she chose the truth. She chose to let the secret out, even though letting the secret out meant destroying everything. She chose honesty, even though honesty came too late to save anyone. And in making that choice, she suggested something important, that redemption is not always possible, but recognition is. That we can acknowledge our complicity without excusing it. That we can understand the terrible choices that people face without absolving them of responsibility for those choices. Asterisk. The key that Eleanor carried in her pocket on the day she died has become a symbol of this complexity. It is not a key to redemption. It is not a key to absolution. It is simply a key and object that opens nothing and opens everything simultaneously. It is a reminder that the world contains locked doors, and that some of those doors protect secrets that should be revealed, and that the cost of revealing those secrets is sometimes the only price worth paying. Asterisk. After Marcus died, the key was passed along. Catherine inherited it and eventually donated it, along with the rest of Eleanor's personal effects, to the museum where Eleanor had spent her career. The museum created an exhibit around the key and Eleanor's story, an exhibit that was controversial and difficult and necessary. The key sat behind glass, labeled simply Asterisk House Key, circa 1954 to 1985, Eleanor Ashford Collection. Asterisk. Visitors would stand before it and read Eleanor's story and wrestle with the questions it raised. What would you have done? How far would you go to protect the life you'd built? At what point does silence become complicity? And at what point does complicity become evil? The exhibit remained open for many years. It was shut down temporarily after a few people complained that it glorified complicity or was insensitive to the victims' families. But it was eventually reopened because ultimately it was decided that Eleanor's story needed to be told, not to excuse her, but to understand her. To understand the ways that ordinary people could become entangled in extraordinary evil. To understand the terrible choices that life sometimes presents. And visitors to the museum would stand before the key and wonder. They would wonder about Eleanor. They would wonder about the 46 people whose names were listed on a plaque beneath the key. They would wonder about the nature of complicity and courage and the price of truth. And some of them, perhaps, would understand something important, that the world is full of locked doors, and that some of those doors need to be opened, no matter what the cost of opening them might be. The key itself became warm again, or perhaps it had never been cold. Perhaps that was simply a detail that had been added and embellished over the years, the way all stories are embellished. But visitors to the exhibits swore that when they held the key, when they were allowed to hold it during special educational sessions, it seemed warm, seemed to contain some kind of heat that could not be explained by the simple transfer of body temperature from hand to metal, seemed to carry within it the weight of Eleanor's 40-year burden, the warmth of her final sacrifice, the heat of the truth that she had finally released into the world. And perhaps that was the real story. Not the story of Douglas Ashford and his crimes, though that story mattered. Not even the story of the investigation and the 46 people whose remains were found, though their story mattered too. But the story of Eleanor, the story of a woman who was faced with an impossible choice and made the wrong choice, and then, at the end of her life, made the right one. The story of a woman who carried a terrible secret and finally decided that the weight of the secret was greater than the weight of revealing it. The story of a woman who understood at the moment of her death that truth mattered more than comfort, that honesty mattered more than survival, that the only redemption available to her was the redemption that came from finally speaking what needed to be said. That story would be told and retold for generations. That story would inspire books and documentaries and academic papers. That story would become part of the cultural conversation about complicity and courage and the terrible choices that ordinary people face. And at the center of that story would be the key, warm or cold, real or mythologized, functioning as both artifact and symbol, both evidence and memorial. Detective Marcus Webb, in his final years, understood this. He understood that the key was not really a key at all, but rather a placeholder, a symbol that could hold multiple meanings simultaneously, a reminder that the world contained mysteries that couldn't be solved, questions that couldn't be answered, secrets that needed to be kept, and also, paradoxically, needed to be told. He understood that complicity was not a simple moral category, but a human reality, that good people could do terrible things by choosing not to act, by choosing to remain silent, by choosing to preserve their own lives at the cost of others' lives. He understood that Eleanor was neither hero nor villain, but something more complex, and more human, a woman who had made impossible choices in impossible circumstances, and had finally, at the end, chosen honesty. And he held the key, both literally and metaphorically, as a reminder of all of this. As a reminder that some doors should be opened, even though opening them means destroying everything. As a reminder that the truth matters, even though the truth is terrible. As a reminder that the weight of secrets is sometimes greater than the weight of speaking them. The investigation into Douglas Ashford and Eleanor Ashford's crimes was officially closed in 1995, 15 months after Eleanor's death. The case files were archived. The houses were demolished. The remains of the victims were properly buried. The world moved on, as it always does, finding new horrors to obsess over, new crimes to debate, new mysteries to solve. But the key remained. The key persisted. The key continued to ask questions that couldn't be answered, to represent truths that couldn't be fully articulated, to carry the weight of Eleanor's terrible choice and her final, redemptive decision to speak. And in museums and in criminology classrooms, and in the minds of people who'd encountered the story, the key remained warm, remained present, remained a monument to the complexity of human nature and the terrible choices that define us. The investigation grew exponentially. The FBI arrived. Then journalists, then lawyers, then psychologists and historians and criminologists, all descending on the case like vultures on a carcass, each one seeing in the story something different, a serial killer tale, a meditation on complicity, an indictment of a society that allowed such things to happen in its midst. Douglas Ashford's life was dissected in excruciating detail. He'd worked as a curator and a teacher. Before that, in his 20s and 30s, he'd worked in real estate, which gave him access to properties and a reason to visit them regularly. He'd been the kind of man who was trusted, quiet, educated, cultured. The kind of man who could explain away regular visits to remote properties or explain away the presence of people in buildings that officially contained no one. The question that everyone asked, but nobody could adequately answer was, why? The psychological evaluation, conducted through interviews with Eleanor, an extensive analysis of Douglas's personal papers, suggested something that might have been worse than simple sadism. Douglas appeared to have genuinely believed that he was saving people. The notes he'd kept, which were more sporadic and less detailed than Eleanor's, but present nonetheless in old filing cabinets in the study, suggested a man who viewed himself as a kind of savior. Margaret tried to kill herself again today. Douglas had written in 1974 about one of his captives. This will be her last time trying. She won't have the strength here. She won't have the means. Here, she is safe. Here, the only thing that can hurt her is herself. And I've removed the tools for that ... Some would call this imprisonment. I call it salvation. Another entry from 1968. The world is too terrible for sensitive people. Some people are born without the armor that others have. Some people feel too deeply, hurt too easily, break too quickly when exposed to the casual cruelty that normal people accept as the price of existing. I have decided to remove them from the world. Not from life, I would never harm them, but from the world. From the competition and the judgment and the endless catalog of failure and rejection and inadequacy that society provides. In my houses, they will know only routine and security and the absence of choice. In my houses, they will be at peace. It was the kind of rationalizing that evil often employed, Marcus would reflect years later. The kind of self-justification that allowed people to do terrible things while believing themselves to be good. The kind of logic that inverted mercy and imprisonment until the prisoner couldn't distinguish between the two. Eleanor's public testimony was brief. She appeared frail and ancient, aged decades beyond her chronological years by the weight of what she'd carried. The prosecution needed her to establish Douglas's mental state, his intentions, the systematic nature of his crimes. But Eleanor had little to say that the ledger hadn't already revealed. Yes, she'd known. No, she hadn't reported it. Yes, she'd participated in maintaining the system. No, she couldn't explain why, except that leaving would have required her to accept responsibility for destroying everything: her marriage, her daughters' lives, her own sense of self. I was a coward. She said simply when asked if she had any statement for the court. I saw something monstrous, and I chose to look away. That's not a legal defense. It's a moral failure. I accept the judgment of this court, and the judgment of God, and the judgment of history. I'm guilty of complicity with evil, and there's no punishment that would be sufficient. She died before the trial concluded. The official cause was listed as heart failure, natural causes. But Marcus, who had followed the case from beginning to end, believed that Eleanor simply couldn't bear the weight of it anymore, that the guilt had finally accomplished what Douglas's 30-year reign had not. It had stopped her heart. The property where Eleanor had hidden the keys became the focus of intense investigation. They discovered that what Eleanor's ledger called deactivated houses weren't destroyed or abandoned. They were simply sealed and allowed to decay. Douglas had apparently found it easier to move on to new properties than to actually eliminate evidence. Inside the deactivated houses, investigators found remnants of occupation, old food containers, bedding, human waste. They found evidence of years of habitation in some cases, decades in others. The oldest deactivated house, located in rural Massachusetts, contained evidence dating back to 1954, the year Douglas and Eleanor married. The house had been sealed for probably 40 years, but inside, forensic analysis suggested that someone had lived there, had been kept there for perhaps 5 or 6 years before being moved elsewhere or released or murdered. There were no remains. The body, if there had been one, had long since decomposed to nothing, but there were personal effects: a hairbrush, a shoe, pieces of clothing. These were eventually matched, through genetic analysis, to a woman who'd been reported missing in 1957, Rebecca Marsh, age 19, who'd been deemed a runaway by police, and whose case had gone cold decades before. By the end of the investigation, 46 people had been accounted for, but the possibility remained that there were more bodies hidden elsewhere, remains that hadn't been discovered, victims whose disappearances had been so thoroughly documented by Douglas and Eleanor and their careful system of sealed houses that nobody had ever thought to look. Marcus was promoted to lieutenant after the case concluded. Sarah transferred to the fraud division, where crimes existed on paper and intentions were clearly documented, and things didn't blur the way they did in homicide. Marcus stayed in homicide, telling himself that by continuing to pursue the worst that people could do to each other, he might somehow prevent it from happening again. Of course, it did happen again. It always did. But the cases that followed were slightly different, slightly more bearable, because they didn't contain the particular horror of this one, the horror of complicity of love, twisted into complicity of a woman who had sacrificed 40 years of her life to a lie. The case made national news. True crime magazines published Eleanor's ledger in its entirety, along with psychological analyses of Douglas Ashford and moral philosophy essays about the nature of culpability and responsibility. The house itself became a kind of dark tourist attraction before it was eventually demolished, its foundations torn out, and the land itself treated as though the soil had been contaminated by the horror that had transpired above it. But for Marcus, the haunting thing wasn't the case itself, it was the keys. He'd kept the 97 keys from Eleanor's collection, along with the one brass key that she'd carried in her pocket on the day she died. They sat in evidence storage in the police department, each one cataloged and photographed and documented. But he thought about them often. He thought about how Eleanor had organized them, each one labeled and indexed, even though many of them opened things that no longer existed. He thought about the care she'd taken in preserving them, as though the keys themselves were artifacts worth saving. Years after the case had concluded, after the perpetrators were dead and the victims had been given proper burial, after the story had faded into the vast repository of American horror that people preferred not to think about, Marcus received a package in the mail at his office. It was unmarked, no return address, containing a single key brass, identical to the one Eleanor had carried on the day she died. Attached to the key was a handwritten letter, written in a hand that Marcus didn't recognize. Asterisk, Detective Webb, asterisk, asterisk, I am the sister of Margaret Hollister. I came to Eleanor's door in 1975, looking for my sister. I stood on her porch with Margaret's photograph and asked if Eleanor had seen her, if she knew where she might have gone. Eleanor told me she'd never heard of anyone by that name, but I could see something in her eyes, fear, perhaps, or knowledge. I suspected then that something was wrong, though I had no proof. It took me 40 years to confirm what I suspected. After the case concluded, I found a way into the first house, the one with the white shutters and green shutters, the one Eleanor called house number 1. Before they demolished it, I searched the rooms. I found this key wedged beneath a floorboard in the basement, alongside a photograph of Margaret taken months before she disappeared. Asterisk,